There is a place in British Columbia, Canada that is known for its pristine lakes, mild climate, excellent camping, and world-class trout fishing. Canadians refer to the area as the BC interior, or just the interior. Anglers who really know their stuff can land 8 to 10 pound rainbow trout. This one is fake, but you get it. The interior is home to some huge hogs, and you don't have to look very far on social media to find pictures of some serious trophy rainbows. And if you're in a family, there's plenty of great fishing for 1 to 2 pound fish to get your kids excited about camping in the great outdoors. Not far from Vancouver, BC is a small town called Merritt, which is situated at the north end of the Nicola Valley. Starting in at least the 1960s, Merritt locals fished a few trophy lakes for decades without issue before a private company, currently owned by a non-resident billionaire, bought up all the land around the lake and cut off access to a publicly funded lake, effectively making it, not public anymore. And at the center of the debate, a single, publicly funded dirt road. Yep, just one dirt road. Factor in an additional layer around the traditional and unceded territory of Indigenous people in an era of decolonization and reconciliation efforts, and this gets really complicated really fast. But let's back up a sec. Okay, let's start at the beginning. What is fishing? Just kidding, we don't need to go that far back. It just seems like every outdoor pursuit these days is faced with overcrowding, be it backcountry skiing, camping in or out of official campsites, fishing on lakes and rivers, and more. There's just people everywhere. Apparently, in the 1980s, when Merritt's entire population was a whopping 6,000 people, there were simply too many anglers on Minnie and Stoney Lakes, just an hour outside of Merritt, and it had to stop. Imagine coming to your favorite fishing spot bright and early in the morning and seeing this. This is unacceptable. So what do you do if you want to get away from the plebes and the riffraff? I don't know about you, but this guy looks like he's having a pretty good time. Anyway, too many little rowboats on your lake? You simply block people's access. You just leverage the shit out of your privilege and cut it off. But wait, what if there's a publicly funded road and government-managed lake? Well, you just buy up all the land around it. Walk on down to the bank, tell them, I want this lake for just me and my buddies, and so I need all the land around it. Pull out your checkbook or like a chest of doubloons or something, because I don't know how these people pay such vast sums of money to become one of the largest landowners in the country, and then buy up all the land around the lake. But what about the public road? You just put a gate across it, and you tell people they can't go in. Enter the Douglas Lake Cattle Company. It's named after a lake that's super far away. The Douglas Lake Cattle Company, often referred to as the Douglas Lake Ranch, is the second largest and one of the oldest working ranches in the country. The beef, no pun intended, flared up over access to Stoney and Minnie Lake by Merritt residents when the cattle company put a gate up blocking access to Stoney Lake. So what's the Douglas Lake Cattle Company anyway? Well, according to their website, the DLCC was founded in 1886, supposedly in hand with the first transcontinental trip of the Canadian Pacific Railway, yeah, that one, and sat on roughly 22,000 acres. As ranching goes, there were ups and downs and lots of Wild West ideas that get glamorized with rose-tinted glasses like, riding into sunsets, showdown at high noon, and handing out smallpox blankets to Indigenous people. Eventually, the ranch was sold in 1959 to a fellow named John West, along with Charles Woodward of the iconic Canadian Woodward's department stores. But set your nostalgia on pause for a sec. By that point, the company had expanded to around 145,000 acres. Not bad, right? This is all before anyone was arguing about access. Simpler times. Anyway, time goes by, and according to the company website, the Douglas Lake Cattle Company exchanges hands with Bernard J. Ebers, who later sells it to, quote, a fellow American. All the news sources like Maclean's and the CBC and the Merritt Herald identify the fellow American as Stan Kroenke, owner of a handful of professional sports teams and generally seen as wealthier than any normie could ever hope to achieve. To be fair to Mr. Kroenke, the story didn't blow up until well into his tenure, and technically it started before his time as the owner, so this issue rests as much with the previous owners as the current ones, but on the other hand, he also didn't rush in to remove the gate and grant locals access. Then there's that whole pesky public road and government-managed lake with wild fish in it thing. On the flip side of the issue are a variety of local residents, and the tip of that spear is a fellow named Rick McGowan. Multiple news sources have interviewed Mr. McGowan over the years, who is a local resident and a member of the Nicola Valley Fishing Game Club. Remember those guys for later. Rick used to travel that public road en route to his folks' place at Paradise Lake, a little further south on the route as Minnie and Stoney, as far back as the 1960s when locals fished the lake without issue. Now, these lakes were considered very productive lakes as far as fishing goes. They were surrounded by land that was partly owned by a family known as the Woodward family, from the department store. Woodward's ended up going out of business in the 90s and filed for bankruptcy, and they're sort of around again in ways that we won't get into, but it's an iconic Canadian brand like Eaton's or Zeller's, or that prime minister who famously choked a guy and invented the Shawnigan handshake. Bottom line, They used to own that land, and those lakes were considered what's called crown property, or what most folks just call crown land. But in this case, it's water and not actual land. What the hell is crown land in Canada? Basically, it's public land. In the US, public land is often referred to as the Bureau of Land Management or just BLM land, but in Canada, it's crown land. Because Canada is a constitutional monarchy, even though England has zero say over what Canada does, but we're not going to untangle that now. Anyway, call it BLM land in the US or crown land in Canada, it means that it's public, and that's managed by the government, and it belongs to everyone. And while this private property might surround the lake, the actual water and fish within the lake are considered to be the property of the Canadian government and therefore the people. So at some point in the 1980s, a gate went up, blocking vehicles and anglers from unloading little boats, often called car toppers. And so began the decades-long argument over access to these two lakes. In the intervening years, there have been arrests made by the local RCMP police detachment over trespassing, while the Fish and Game Club has always argued that the road is public. There have been hundreds of thousands of dollars spent on this, countless volunteer hours going back and forth on the issue, and accusations of misdemeanors and trespassing. So let's look at the timeline of events. In the 1960s, local residents and First Nations people were fishing those lakes without issue. In the 1980s, a gate goes up and access is blocked. They bicker about it for some years, but then things start to really escalate in the 2000s. This is about when Krenke buys the Douglas Lake Cattle Company. In 2011, members of the Nicola Valley Fish and Game Club went around the gate to hold a fish out on Minnie Lake, and the RCMP were invited to keep an eye on things. Ranch workers told them that they were trespassing, but no fines or arrests were made. The ranch argued as far back as 2012 that the lakes are surrounded by private property and it's within the ranch's right to block access. There's even an incident mentioned where access by air was prevented, implying that some really committed anglers tried to fly a float plane onto the lake. The then regional director for the Ministry of Transportation, Norm Parks, wrote in a statement in 2012 that a, quote, historical roadway, end quote, did run near Minnie Lake in the northeast side of Stoney Lake and connected to Pennask Lake Road, but it was discontinued in 1975 when the ranch built a bypass route with permission from the Ministry of Transportation. Boom. Done. Case closed. Hard to argue with that, right? But wait, the Fish and Game Club members uncovered a letter from 1996 from the then District Highways Manager, a fellow by the name of D.S. Kirk, in which the government told the Douglas Lake Cattle Company to remove the gate, implying the government had jurisdiction over the road. Fast forward to around 2014, and people just start cutting locks on gates, vigilante style, and go into the lake regardless. Things escalate. In 2014, RCMP Sergeant Norm Fleming stated that the members of the Fish and Game Club could be charged with a crime for cutting the locks because while the road may be in dispute, the locks are ranch property. So let's unpack this. The private company is using their privately owned equipment, in this case a padlock, to block a public road. But it's illegal for a private company to simply block a public road. It would therefore face seizure by the police of whatever said company was using to block the said road. Could be a padlock, could be a truck parked across the road with its doors locked. Now, if the police are notified and fail to unblock said road, and a member of the public removes the privately owned item, that's a crime. So even if the police have let it sit for a decade or more, remember folks, if your jerk neighbor blocks your driveway with their car, you basically can't do anything about it. Even if you ask the government, who's in charge of the roads, to move said car, and they don't move it, you can't move it either. So good luck getting to work on time. Later on that year, Rick McGowan and other members of the Fish and Game Club were summoned to the Merritt County Corrections Office and were offered a compromise. If they signed an adult alternative dispute resolution, it meant they'd be admitting to mischief, agreeing to community supervision, and could avoid going to criminal court. They all refused, and the locks continued to be mysteriously cut off the gate. In 2015, the Douglas Lake Cattle Company sued the Nicola Valley Fish and Game Club and the province of BC, with the cattle company claiming that the fish in the lake were effectively domesticated animals and that they are ranch property. Therefore, by retaining any fish for consumption, that fell under trespassing, somehow. Because the government sets the quota, not the ranch. But the ranch is saying that they own the fish that they put in the public lake, which already had wild fish in it, and it's the lake that the government manages. Anyway, the ranch went on to argue that if lakes are reserved for the Crown, that does not mean the public has access rights, whether over private land or otherwise. Can you imagine having the gall to say something like that? Hey, this thing that's owned by the public and it's accessible by a public road, which while it's technically on private property, it was subsidized by taxpayer dollars, the public can't use it anymore. This whole lake that's managed by the government, no one can touch except me and my friends. So this cattle ranch goes ahead and they sue the Fish and Game Club. And like, what does this look like? I keep picturing this weathered, sun-baked cowboy showing up on a horse. He pulls out some paper of his saddlebag and he's like, "We're suing you." But this is Canada, and it's really hard to get a handgun here. So he's got like water pistols, hops on his horse and rides off. And what were the fish and game guys doing? Fixing a boat, sharpening some broadheads, tying flies, and this cowboy ambles up and sues them. It probably didn't go down like that. So these guys are saying that even though the fish might be in publicly managed waters, we decide whether or not the public gets access. Oh, and also, we can go in there anytime we want and fish those suckers out, but no one else can. The province has also disputed the ranch's claim to the quote new shoreline that has been expanded by the damming of the lake's outflow. The ranch argued that the new bigger, wider shoreline is ranch property since they made it, because when humans mess with an ecosystem, it never has any consequences. The province feels otherwise, which is reasonable since lakes and rivers tend to rise and fall with the change in seasons, and the ranch allegedly dammed the lakes without a permit. Nice one, guys. Anyway, the ranch sues the Fish and Game Club. Rick McGowan from the Fish and Game Club is arguing that the ranch is stealing public resources from future generations. The ranch is arguing that the lakes are now theirs because of their modifications to the lake, and they've been stocking it with more fish. Once the Fish and Game Club got sued, they estimated the legal costs would be over $200,000 when the dust settled, and they had to start holding monthly fundraisers and raffles to cover them. It's probably safe to assume that the second largest cattle company in the country didn't have to hold raffles and fundraisers to cover their costs. So the ranch and the Fish and Game Club go to the mat. In court, the Fish and Game lawyers argue that Douglas Lake Cattle Company had enlarged the lakes without a permit, among many other actions by the ranch without government approval. The Fish and Game Club also argued that the Water Sustainability Act states that all water, including lakes, is owned by the Crown unless rights are granted otherwise. The judge was told that the Douglas Lake Cattle Company dammed Stoney and Minnie lakes to make them bigger, even partially flooding the road at one point. The ranch argued that the expanded borders of the lake were private property. The ranch also put large rocks and logs across the road, making it impossible to pass. The Fish and Game Club also argued that the Hunting and Fishing Heritage Act states that a hunter or fisher can cross over the entirety of land, whether it's Crown or not, the only requirement being having a valid license. On top of that, the Fish and Game Club also criticized the lack of transparency and due diligence by the provincial government, claiming that the ranch manager had convinced the former district manager for transportation to quit claim Stoney Lake Road, where he had claimed that a land exchange took place in 1976, which made Stoney Lake Road back into private property. Quote, "They proceeded as though a land swap for Stoney Lake Road for the bypass did take place. They started legal proceedings and surveys based on that, which are all false." One would think that if a land exchange took place, the ranch would be able to provide a record of it, or the government would have a copy. Pretty standard bureaucratic stuff. The Fish and Game Club also dropped a bomb by claiming that local law enforcement was giving the ranch special treatment. During the trial, the defense claimed that the local RCMP police detachment had helped the DLCC identify the owners of vehicles that were trying to access the road on the ranch property, and that the ranch carries, quote, "a lot of weight," end quote, in the Nicola Valley region, and the ranch manager had used, quote, "threats and lies," end quote, to bully public servants and even law enforcement to prevent the public from accessing the two lakes. Justice Joel Groves questioned why the RCMP seemed to be working so closely with the ranch to provide information on the identity of vehicle owners based on license plate information, which is totally private and confidential. To further illustrate his point, he added, quote, "Victims of crimes, I don't think, are regularly called by the RCMP and told the license plate of the person who broke into your house is the guy down the street." Testimony lasted 4 weeks. The lawsuit was expected to set a precedent for approximately 30 lakes in similar circumstances. The ranch claimed it owned the lakes in their entirety all around the property, and that they had built a world-class fishery through engineering practices, and that the lakes were barren waters anyway, in spite of decades of anglers using these lakes. In December 2018, Justice Groves rendered a decision to allow the public access to Stoney Lake Road. The lakes must be reopened for catch-and-release fishing. The ranch cannot block access to the lake. Also, the fish are considered wild, even if the ranch added more by stocking the lake. Groves stated that the ranch may also have to remove the dams it had built. He also put limits on anglers, stating that there must be catch-and-release fishing only. Sounds pretty reasonable. His ruling is nicely summarized here. Quote, "It would be nonsensical for a government to retain the rights to a lake if by virtue of a single owner purchasing all the land surrounding a lake, that owner could prohibit public use or ownership of the lake." If we zoom out to 30,000 feet, there's a little bit of what's stopping someone from buying up all the land around an iconic surf spot, or a jewel of a lake, or all the land below like an iconic ski area and just finding some weird legal loophole or technicality like a misplaced check mark on a government document that cuts off everybody else. More from Groves. Quote, "It only makes sense that government would have retained the ownership of bodies of waters, lakes, with the intention of the public being allowed to access the water they retained." Groves called out the provincial government for inaction due to the findings from provincial officials all the way back in 1996, stating that, quote, "Over 20 years, a privately held corporation owning a large swath of land prohibited the public from driving on a public road, and the province did nothing. This is most unfortunate. The province has continuously failed the citizens of British Columbia." Groves wrote a 5-page epilogue urging the government to review and change its laws to regulate access and conflicts surrounding lake access and ownership as well as around Crown land. Failing to do so could lead to more expensive litigation. The judge also noted that Stoney Lake Road, the road at the center of all of this, was deemed public because public money had been used to maintain it, as well as it had previously been used as a trail from a local indigenous village. Case closed! Hooray for the little guy! Slow down there, hombre. Enter the appeals court. In 2020, the Douglas Lake Cattle Company appeals Justice Groves' decision, asking for the decision to be reversed so that there's a declaration that Stoney Lake has no public access and that access to Minnie Lake is via Wassley Creek only, which is a 3-foot wide creek a pedestrian can walk down, but it's impossible to launch a car topper. Fast forward to 2021, and the BC Court of Appeal overturns the 2018 decision, taking the side of the Douglas Lake Cattle Company, citing that the lower court erred in 2018 because portions of the historical Indigenous trail and road leading to the lakes are not public because they don't quite reach the shoreline of either lake. Even though the water's public, there's no way of getting there without crossing private property. Rick McGowan argues that this will impact not just fishing, but hiking routes and camping across the entire province, and he's probably right. The Fish and Game Club filed an appeal with the Supreme Court of Canada. It was declined. Where are we at today? With the Supreme Court of Canada declining to hear the appeal from the Fish and Game Club, Stoney Lake is completely cut off from public access and Minnie Lake can be accessed on foot only from a still public Pennask Lake Road. At the moment, members of the public can pay to go fish these lakes that are public lakes and managed by the government, and the ranch now presents these as private access lakes. You can pay to camp on the property, or rent out the Stoney Lake Lodge to the tune of $2,000 per night. In this era of exploding food prices, high interest rates, and housing affordability being worse than it's ever been, I can't imagine the average person just has $2,000 lying around to drop on a fishing lodge. So from 30,000 feet, you've got these 2 public lakes. They've been fished by the public forever, and the deep pockets of someone else's legal resources allowed that to be cut off from public access. And that is ridiculous privilege. If you've made it this far, thank you very much for watching. Please like and subscribe, and if you know about a story of ridiculous privilege that you think people should know about, drop it in the comments. Sources include the CBC, the Merritt Herald, Maclean's, the Globe and Mail, the Tyee, and more are listed in the description. Thanks for watching.